calendars now. And speaking of the calendar, I noticed when I looked with a bit of a startle at the Jewish calendar that we're just only about 5 weeks away from Rosh Hashanah and the beginning of the year 5783. And so as we move now into this last month of 5782, I want to tell you something special about the year that we are just in the last few weeks of. You may or may not know this, but every Hebrew year whose number is evenly divisible by 7 has something unique about it. I've done the math, so you don't have to do it. This year that we're in now, 5782, is equal to 7 times 826. So this is one of those special years. When we're in a year like this, whose number is divisible evenly by 7, that means that we are in what the Bible calls a year of Shemitah, a sabbatical year. According to the biblical law about Shemitah, which appears in this week's Torah portion, 1 year out of every 7 provides a kind of reset button for the entire Jewish community. In every Shemitah year, farmers would leave their fields to lie fallow, neither planting nor harvesting. They would even relinquish formal ownership over their fields altogether. But the other primary hallmark of these sabbatical years, which has driven countless Jewish commentators to weigh in on the events of this week's news, is that in every 7th year, the Bible decrees that monetary debts are to be forgiven. So, in case you missed it, the connection is that earlier this week, the president announced an executive order in keeping with biblical law to provide a limited measure of student debt forgiveness, for which it is looking like the majority of the 40 million Americans who are carrying federal student loans will be eligible to benefit. They're still estimating exactly what the numbers will be, but it looks like this move may stand to eliminate completely the student debt of about 20 million people. Obviously, given the timing of that executive order and the rules about the sabbatical year in this week's Torah portion, the Jewish media this week has been on fire with countless opinions, both for and against the executive order eliminating certain forms of federal student debt. So a large number of thinkers on one side of the argument have criticized the plan on the basis that also in biblical law, financial agreements ought to be permanently binding on the borrower and also reliable for the lender, while those on the other side of the argument have celebrated the move because they see loan forgiveness as being in line with the ancient principles of biblical ethics, which is, I will say, a little bit ironic, given that most of the people on this side of the argument believe that biblical ethics are probably the last thing that they'd like to see shaping American politics. But be that as it may, there is this very interesting and enriching overlap between this week's teaching about the Shemitah year and the movement for federal debt relief that we're reading about in the papers. So I think it's helpful this evening to reflect just a little bit about what the two may have in common and where they diverge as well. All right, so first the big question is, in what ways might we see debt relief on a national level as an outgrowth of Jewish principles about lending and borrowing, or at least as sitting in line with some of those values? First, it is clear that our spiritual tradition prohibits lending which is abusive or predatory. Lenders are explicitly forbidden, for example, to take a borrower's only coat as collateral for a loan in the winter. For example, lenders are prohibited from ransoming someone's children as payment for a debt. Lenders can't manipulate the terms of a loan so that a borrower will be chained to it permanently in poverty. The rules of Shemitah demonstrate that our tradition supports the idea that it's generally a good thing for society to create periodic escape hatches from which the poor can emerge from under mountains of debt. Jewish law also rebuts the argument that we read occasionally in the press this week that debt relief is unjust if public funding is used to relieve the obligations of those who took on the loans. There are all sorts of cases in Jewish thought and Jewish history in which funds are approved to be collected from the public to relieve burdens which fall disproportionately on certain individuals or certain groups, because we believe there is a higher value in creating a shared society which is compassionate and safe, from which from which all residents benefit from a better quality of life. So on one hand, forgiveness of student debt like this is in line with ancient Jewish thought about the Shemitah year, but there are certain serious liabilities to seeing this as an expression of biblical ethics. Because the value of compassionate debt maintenance in Jewish thought is not an absolute value. The ancient rabbis knew, just as we see today, that a system of cyclical debt relief can also be manipulated in ways that are unfair to lenders. What if, for example, a borrower takes out an exorbitant loan in the last few days of the 6th year before a sabbatical? Can he realistically expect for his loan to be completely forgiven a few days later? And what about the lenders who, looking ahead to the arrival of a sabbatical year, even 2 or 3 years down the road, simply refuse to lend to the poor out of an excessive caution that they may lose their principal? So it's important not to arrive at an incorrect conclusion about the Bible's rules about the forgiveness of debt every 7 years. It's not the case that lending and borrowing, even at interest, is evil or immoral. That's not a Jewish idea. We might think that because it's virtuous to relieve debt every 7 years, then it would be even more pious and compassionate to eliminate debt altogether. But this is not the case. In fact, Jewish thought recognizes that ethical, reliable systems of lending and borrowing are critical to the smooth and prosperous functioning of economic systems. Not everyone has access to capital, and those who do have it are unlikely to lend it to a debtor without incentives or assurances that they'll be repaid. The ancient sages recognized this, and they wanted their societies to encourage human flourishing and industrious creativity, and so they worked within the system of sabbatical years to provide variable rates of interest for different sorts of borrowers. They developed financial instruments which allowed long-term debt to be carried and financed even beyond the 7-year term in certain cases. Debt is not inherently immoral in Jewish thought, and forgiving it is not inherently virtuous. Our Torah portion reminds us of another principle that helps cast an important piece of light on this truth. Just a few verses after it commands the establishment of the Shemitah year, the book of Deuteronomy proclaims, Ki lo yachdal evyon mikerav haaretz, there will never cease to be poverty in your land. Despite our best efforts, despite our faithful and energetic commitment to doing tzedakah, to giving charity, to caring for those in need, no matter what, our communities will never be immune to poverty, and we'll always be living in some proximity to the poor. Now, when some readers encounter this verse, they feel deeply disappointed. But I want to tell you that the recognition that poverty will always be a challenge in human society is not a defeatist read of the Bible. This observation is not a curse. It's not meant to discourage us. Instead, it's a reminder that we always have work to do. We always have the opportunity to heal and care for those who are in need. If we persist in a sort of mystical view of debt relief, seeing it as a magic solution that will permanently relieve injustice and inequality, we're neither acting realistically nor in line with classical Jewish thought. It is regrettable that there will never cease to be poverty among us, but there is room for human ingenuity and human kindness, lending and borrowing, which will make it possible for people to better themselves and improve their lot in life. What is required is that lenders be compassionate, that terms be transparent, and that those who borrow not be subjected to a lifetime sentence of poverty which is desperate and inescapable. So if we want an answer to the question about whether it's fair to say that federal student loan forgiveness is an expression of Jewish values, yes and no. Certainly, it will offer a step out of poverty to those who are struggling, especially as it will benefit the neediest borrowers. It's also in keeping with the Jewish value to prioritize education, which is still the best way for many people to improve their lives and boost their potential. I think it's also good by Jewish legal values that it opens up a way toward deferments and forgiveness for those who participate in national service and military service, since it's also a Jewish value to encourage choices that benefit society as a whole. There is still much to be done, and much ink will still be spilled by the economists who will help us figure out the additional scrutiny that needs to be set aside for universities and government policies. There's a lot more thinking and a lot more writing to be done by people who are much smarter and wiser than I am about economic policy. But what I can offer you instead of an economic perspective is a rabbinic one, which is my joy and satisfaction that this move has brought so many to deeper contemplation of our scriptural and ethical tradition, and that it's presented us with an opportunity to consider the imperatives of the system of Shemitah years, like this one which we are in, for just another few weeks or so. And it is my hope that this reflection and others like it will bring us in these next 5 weeks and in the year to come to a deeper understanding of the needs of our people, the challenges of our nation, and the invitations to deeper compassion and forgiveness for all. May this be the truth for all of us, for our community, and for our nation. Amen.